haven't been here for a while. I think I'm going to go back and do the introduction from what's that? Read the Bible, or I can't remember. But anyway, it's back here, and play that so that we get a good overview. And look at all those neat pictures we're passing up. Okay, number 8. I looked it up. Okay, here we go.
The book of Daniel, the story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power, and so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament. And there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final 2 beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is the image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
Okay. I'm always amazed at how creative those are. And that was before AI got big, so that wasn't drawn by AI. Let's get to where we're at right now. Okay. All right, so a few more details just to give you about the background. Daniel was written at about 530 BC, and Daniel the prophet who wrote it was about 90 years old. So after everything has happened, he's looking back, and with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and the ability of the Holy Spirit to make sure he doesn't forget anything, he writes at 90. We're not told when Daniel died, but even to make it to 90, especially in this day and age, was an amazing thing. He is the author, of course, and his name means God is my judge. And then just a very quick outline, which you saw very graphically done with the other, but you have the great image that takes place in chapter 2. You have the historical introduction where they're taken, and it was interesting. He said they were recruited to serve in the kingdom. They didn't have a choice. They were kidnapped, they were captives, and the best ones from the best families who already had a good education were taken to serve the king in Babylon. Very, very likely, because this was the normal. If you served in the king's castle, you were turned into a eunuch. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, and it's incidental, but it's quite possible that Daniel and his three friends were eunuchs. And you think about what they had to suffer as far as their next generation goes. There wasn't going to be one. Again, the Bible doesn't say it, but it was the custom. If you served there in the kingdom, in the palace, you were a eunuch. All right, and so then in chapter 2, Daniel sees his great image. We're going to look at that a little bit. Then Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, that's their trial in the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar's vision of a high tree, cut down, iron band placed around it. He turns into an animal, comes back to himself and praises the God of Daniel as the greatest God. He didn't become a believer in that sense, but he does understand that he answers to Daniel's God. Belshazzar was actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandson or great-grandson, not his son. The Bible uses the term son, but it often uses that just to say from that generation. And so that's where they see the handwriting on the wall. That very night, Babylon fell. The Medes and the Persians had already encircled the city, and they diverted the river that ran through the middle of Babylon. In fact, some of the pictures we looked at showed the river running right through the city, and the hanging gardens of Babylon were quite famous. They diverted the river, and they just marched in where it went under the wall and took the whole city by surprise, while Belshazzar was having a party because he thought, well, they can't get in. Nobody can get past these walls. Darius the Mede is the one who puts Daniel in the lion's den. And then we have the vision of the four beasts, the Ancient of Days, and the Son of Man in chapter 7. And then from that point, it goes into, these are the pictures, all of these are the days of the Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles. And here, it starts to center on the Hebrews and how they're going to make it through that time. And so it becomes Daniel's visions, and it becomes Daniel seeing what's going to happen to Israel. And he sees, first of all, the vision of the ram and the goat and the little horn. And he sees the prophecy of 70 weeks. And then finally, he sees Israel through the centuries, chapter 10 through 12. We didn't go into that one. It's extremely, extremely detailed. And to get much out of it, you're going to have to spend a lot more time and look at a lot more history. And it is part of that is very cloudy. But it's so accurate, showing the invasion of Alexander, showing the rule of Antiochus, all those things that happened centuries after Daniel, that people who read it afterwards could only say, well, really, Daniel couldn't have written it. It had to be written by somebody else who just put Daniel's name on it, even though we know there are copies that go that far back and farther. Again, it's like a lot of things that people who don't believe in God have to deal with. They just deny it, come up with some fantastic idea. They don't have any proof for it. There's no way to prove it. They just can't accept the idea of prophecy. They can't accept the idea of a God who knows all things and knows the future and holds the future. And so they just simply deny it. But if you did take the time to study chapters 10 through 12 and then look at the history of that time period that it's talking about, it's amazing how quickly or how accurate the different campaigns take place. And I say this because we had to do it in college. It is very time-consuming. It's worthwhile, but I didn't think it'd be something that would be all that worthwhile for us. All right, So now, looking at the times that we're looking at when it was written, so Ezekiel and Daniel were both written during the exile. And there's another book that goes from just before the exile and into the exile, also one of the prophetic books. Which one was that? Wrote from Jerusalem, and then he gets kidnapped and taken to Egypt. I can give you a hint on the next part. There's 5 prophetic books, major books. It's one of those. Jeremiah. Jeremiah was writing from inside Jerusalem, and then he tells the people, surrender. God has sent them. Don't fight them. Surrender. They wouldn't listen to him. The city was then taken and destroyed, which it didn't have to be destroyed. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't destroy it when he first took it. And then ultimately, Jeremiah is taken and kidnapped by his own people and taken, we believe, to Egypt where he died. But he sent his letter, his book, to the captives, and that's why Daniel had the book to read when Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy is given there. So there are 3 invasions that take place that finally wipe out the southern kingdom of Judah. First, 605 BC. That's when Daniel and the 3 friends are taken. And then 8 years later, in 597 BC, Ezekiel is taken then. And he was a common person, not a noble. He may not even lived in Jerusalem. He may have lived in the outside area. And that happened because there was rebellion under the king, Jehoiakim, I think, during that time. And then finally, in 587 BC, there's another, Zerubbabel has another rebellion. And so 10 years later, they come in. This time, Nebuchadnezzar tears the walls down, goes into the temple, takes everything out of the temple, destroys it, and everybody who's left in the city are taken. Whereas before, he had left people and was going to just have them be there. But because they would not listen to Jeremiah, ultimately, they are taken. And that's when Jeremiah is taken as well. The themes of the book, prophecy, of course, relating to the coming of the Messiah. And as it was mentioned in the overview there, it's the faithfulness of God's people when living among pagans and their sin. As such, it has a lot of application for us. That's why in Sunday school you hear about Daniel in the lion's den, and you hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because that still has, we are God's people living in pagan world still to this day. And we have to fight some of the same temptations and some of the same trials that we're going to go through. In other places, it's much worse, but very definitely something that has a real application. I can remember as a little kid hearing those stories and relating and saying, that's what I would want to do. I want to do what God's Word said and not what the world was telling me to do. And so that's the main purpose of the book. Be faithful to God even when you're in a place where other people are not being faithful. All right, I think I just left these 2 at the top of yours. And again, this is just the breakdown, the survey chart. It gives the chapters. It gives the things that are happening within that chapter. Here's the king through chapter 5. Here's Belshazzar in chapter 5. Here's Darius in chapter 6. Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus here. And then this is mainly historical, and this is mainly prophetic. Chapters, 6 historical narratives and 4 apocalyptic visions. And we named this, or titled it, The Apocalypse of the Old Testament. And again, it's just good to have these charts. It gives you an overview, something you can keep in your Bible. I would love to have a Bible with Jensen's, this is Jensen's chart, have that on the page that starts the book of Daniel. It'd just be a great thing to have, but I don't think anybody ever did that. All right, so this is the first dream, Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He may or may not have forgotten it. He may just be putting a test upon the wise men, the so-called wise men of Babylon. And he tells them, I can't remember the dream, so you tell me what I dreamed, and then you interpret what you're going to tell me I dreamed. And they all say, we can't do that. So he says, well, kill them all. And that would include Daniel and the 3 Hebrew friends. And so, of course, Daniel hears about this, and he says, let me talk to him. Maybe I can do something. And the Lord blessed, and he was given the dream and the interpretation. And so the vision he saw, the symbol he saw, was a head of gold, breast of silver, midsection of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And we read that and we think of like Play-Doh, but it's talking about ceramic clay. It's talking about pottery. And it talks about because it was hard, and when it's struck by the stone, it breaks and cracks. And so it's ceramic clay is what they're talking about. And then you have, these are the kingdoms, Babylon, which was 606 to 539, Medo-Persia, which ultimately just became Persia, 539 to 334, Greece, 334, 67, Rome, 67 to 476 AD. And when you look at the time spans, you see why Rome was such a important empire. We are still under the influence of what Rome did. Much of our culture is based upon what Rome did and how they did it. And then there's going to be a time in which that same influence is going to solidify again into a new Roman Empire, whether it's the European Common Market or whatever it might be. But it will contain those kingdoms. There'll be 10 of them that are either prominent or total, we're not sure. And that kingdom will be the kingdom through which the 10 toes appear. And during that time, of course, is going to be the tribulation. People do point out that the two legs, the Roman Empire was divided to the eastern and the northern. Rome and Byzantium were the two kingdoms, or Constantinople. And so it was actually a two-legged kingdom from this time forward. And then again, one day it'll be a revived kingdom as well. Then he has the next vision. This one's Daniel's. And it relates right back to this kingdom because, again, God is telling Daniel, this is the time of the Gentiles. This is what's going to be happening now for a long, long time. And until 1948, Israel was not a kingdom again. From 70 A.D. till 1948, they did not exist as a nation. And so again, Babylon is the goal, but also it's the winged lion, which was a common symbol of the Babylonian Empire. Medo-Persia was a bear that was raised up on one side, which signifies that Persia became the most powerful part of that kingdom. It had 3 ribs in its mouth, which represented 3 of the kingdoms that it destroyed in order to rise to power, including the Babylonian Empire was one of those. And then the Greek Empire was represented by a 4-winged leopard showing its speed and its ferocity. And then Rome, of course, is shown as this terrible beast. Daniel doesn't know what to call it. This artist did it as a 10-horned T-Rex, I guess, which is as good as anything else. That would be pretty terrible to see. And during that, there is, of course, the 10 kingdoms, the 10 horns. 3 of them are uprooted, and a single little horn becomes a big horn during that time. Then Daniel has a dream in chapter 8. Chapter 8. And again, the same kingdoms, but it zeroes in on these 2. So this is Medo-Persia, this is Greece. He sees a goat with 1 horn, and then as he watches, this goat comes so fast that its feet don't even touch the ground. It strikes the ram, which had all kinds of power and seemed like nothing could stand against it. The ram destroys it quickly, and then the ram develops 4 horns. And again, the only way you can explain this is that God simply knew what was going to happen, saw what was going to happen, and worked through providence to bring it about. So Alexander the Great dies at 33, 34 years old, quite young, after an all-night drinking party. And his 4 generals then take over his kingdom. And from that point until the Roman Empire, there's 4 major kingdoms that are ruling throughout the Mediterranean region. And so those are the names of the generals. And the only one that really has much to do with us is the Seleucid kingdom. But I'll give you here's the list of those that are on your paper. So Macedonia went to Cassander. Asia Minor went to Lysimachus. Syria went to Seleucus. And Egypt went to Ptolemy. Syria and Seleucian kingdom are going to be a problem for Israel. because Syria is Palestine in their mind. They ruled over Jerusalem. And of course, this is when the Maccabean revolt takes place, and the king that we're going to bring up, Antiochus Epiphanes, comes into place. So, yeah, I think we got the rest of that on there. All right. And again, this is hundreds of years before it happened, hundreds of years after Daniel was dead. And so people who don't believe the Bible just can't accept that, and they say, no, it happened afterwards, and somebody just said it was Daniel. Again, there's proof that that absolutely is a lie. Then we talked about the horn that came up from the from the 10-horned beast here, and that horn was a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means one who appears like God, one who has a divine appearance. So he proclaimed himself as God, and he's the little horn of Daniel chapter 8, and that is a foreshadowing of the Antichrist in the Revelation, and he is the fulfillment of the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. Now there's a little different. There's two horns that are talked about. Antiochus came from the Greek Empire, and that's Daniel 8. The Antichrist comes from the Roman Empire, that's Daniel 7. So even though they are both pictures of the Antichrist, they are two different people. The little horn in Daniel 8 is definitely Antiochus Epiphanes. And one thing that's not very strong on that introduction, it's not they're all right. They are right because, and this Antiochus Epiphanes was what was called a foreshadowing. And again, people who have a problem with prophecy don't see this. But in the same way that John the Baptist is a foreshadowing of the witnesses that take place in the book of Revelation, he claimed, I'm not Elijah, Elijah's still to come. But he was a foreshadowing of that. And the Bible's filled with these kinds of fulfillment. And you can look even differently. There's types like Jacob being a type of Jesus Christ. And there are foreshadowings like this that are prophecy that are not fulfilled twice, but in a sense have, again, the best word is just that it's a foreshadowing. And the reason for that is Antiochus Epiphanes, God warned his people who are going to be living under his rule, this is what he's going to do, this is how bad he is. And then it's a warning for those who are going to be in the tribulation. God's people, again, the nation of Israel, when that little horn, you see him, he's going to act like Antiochus Epiphanes. He's going to take away the offerings, the oblation, the sacrifice. And when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then you know. And he's talking to his people. He says, when you see that, don't go into the house. Don't even go back in for clothes. You run for the hills immediately. And here's two warnings, this one, and then the one that's in the book of Revelation, and of course the other one that's here with Daniel chapter 7. All right. And then probably, I don't know if you say the most important, but it is a very important prophecy. And that is the 70 weeks prophecy. I don't know how I missed the whole thing, but go here. So, Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. Daniel is reading the Bible, or he's reading about the prophecy from Jeremiah, and he reads it and it says 70 years that the Babylonians will be destroyed, and he says, okay, that means Israel can be released, Israel can go back. And he also knows that in his prayer, he confesses and he says, we haven't changed. They may have been more idolatrous in the land of Babylon than they were. And he says, we haven't changed. We're still sinning. Our fathers have sinned. We have sinned. And so in his mind, I think he's asking God, how are we going to go back and nothing has changed? And so God sends the angel Gabriel. He tells him it's not 70 years that are needed in order to bring about Israel's return to God. It's 70 times 7 weeks. And so it's 490 years is what he's talking about. So he gives him a much longer timetable. And from what we know, looking at it now, it's much longer than 490 years. It's been thousands and thousands of years. But it does start as he talks about. So he gives him, Jeremiah's prophecy will be fulfilled, is about 50 years into it that Daniel reads about it. And so after Daniel probably died, that prophecy is fulfilled. They return under Ezra, under Nehemiah, under Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel their governor. And so they go back. The temple is restarted. People are allowed to return, but not until Nehemiah is given permission from the king to rebuild the wall does that timetable start. And so when that happened, 490 years kicked in. So here are the things that were supposed to happen during that time period. So chapter 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. So again, this is a Jewish prophecy. It is about the Jewish people and the Israelite people. And he says, this is what's going to happen during that time period. They're going to finish the transgression. I think that's talking about their rebellion and their worship of other idols. To make an end of sins, to make a reconciliation for iniquity. So the first three are negative. They are taking and looking at the sin that took place that put them into captivity. Then the other three are very positive. To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy. It's got everything's going to be fulfilled. And to anoint the most holy, which is probably talking about the temple. Where's my last one? There it is. So he says all these things will have to happen. And again, the temple had been destroyed, and so all these things have to be finished and brought back. So these 6 purposes started when Nehemiah got the permission to return and rebuild the wall. And here's the chart that I put together to try and show this as best I could. So that started restoration of Israel. It takes 7 weeks and it's 49 years to totally rebuild. Everything's brought back, everything's up. It only took 50-something days to rebuild the wall. But for everything to be back the way that it was, they're still looking for everything to be finished in the time of Malachi. But 49 years from that time period, and then it's going to be finished. And he says 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. He breaks it up to let you know that this part is dealing with Jerusalem being rebuilt, and this part is being dealt with when Messiah would come back. So from this point, 445 BC, that command was given by Artaxerxes the fourth, something like that, to Nehemiah. And from that point to this point, Messiah is going to be revealed. Not his birth, not his baptism. Because the Persians kept records so well, you can actually go back and look and see that it works out to his entering into Jerusalem during the triumphal entry. And of course, that, if you look at it, that is the time that Jesus holds nothing back. He doesn't tell anybody, don't tell anyone, or don't say anything about this. He goes in, he knows what Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 says. They know what it says, and he does exactly what it says. And then he accepts their praise. At one point, they called out and said, tell them to be quiet. And you remember what Jesus said when they said, tell them to be quiet? He says, if I tell them to be quiet, even the rocks would cry out. There's no doubt that he's saying, this is my declaration. I am the Messiah. And so he comes in, all those verses, all those verses are about the triumphal entry. And so now we're at 434 years. We had the time between. And at 483 years, Messiah is revealed. And then Daniel says, let's just look it up. Daniel chapter 9 real quick. So we can get the verses down right. Okay, I passed it up. There it is. All right, so Daniel chapter 9, go down to verse 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Now, everything to this point has been very exact. 49 years, 434 years, and Jesus is going to be revealed, the Messiah, at 483 years. But this verse says after 62 weeks. We're not told an exact time. We just know it's after. Now, we know, because we have the New Testament, that it was exactly right after that. Within a week, Jesus is crucified. But that's not told here. It's just after. And everything that takes place between now and the covenant that starts the tribulation is just after. We're in a time period, that gap period, and so we're not told when it's going to start again until then. So Jesus is crucified, and the temple is destroyed in 70 A.D., and that was part of the prophecy as well. Let's see. Look at the last part of that verse. But Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. That happened in 70 A.D. The temple was literally destroyed, and the ones who did it were the Romans. And this prophecy says, the prince that shall come, the little horn, that's going to be from the Roman Empire. Those people will have a prince. But those people, before the prince is there, he'll destroy that. Verse 27, and he, talking about the prince, verse 27, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease for the overspreading of abominations. He shall make it desolate. And when Jesus talks about this in Matthew, he says, when you hear the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, that's what we usually call it, the abomination of desolation. So all of that took place, and when that took place, then there's 1 week left here, this 7-year time period, 483 years, and we have this 1 7-year time period left of the 490. And so in a sense, God had like a stopwatch, and he just clicked it and said, that's it. And we're going to wait until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And then one day that's going to start again. And he tells us when it's going to start, when the confirmation of the covenant is done for 1 week, 1 7-year time period. So that 1 week's left, and what starts that again is that covenant. It will be everything you read, everything it seems like. It's going to be a covenant that gives Israel the guarantee of safety. It's going to give them peace. And they're going to look to this great leader as something like a Messiah, that he was able to give them this kind of peace. And so they will look to him. They think he's their hero. He's their great. But then in the middle of the week, he breaks the covenant. They don't have the right to their own worship. They don't have the right to their own temple. He's going to put something in there that's going to be an abomination, and it's going to desanctify the temple. And we know from the book of Revelation that's probably going to be the image of the Antichrist that the false prophet creates. And so when they see that, they'll know absolutely that can't be our hero. That can't be our Messiah. And they will run if they have read Daniel, if they have read Matthew, and maybe they'll at this point realize that Jesus was their Messiah. Then at that point, the Bible says, then will come great tribulation. So for 3.5 years, there is a more intense. Up till this point, the things that happen during the 7-year time period are general over the world. We have maybe a comet crashing. We may have a meteor crashing. We have the different things that are taking place with the oceans and all the things that take place there, but they're not targeted. But here, that tribulation turns on the Israelite people, and God turns his wrath upon the people that are persecuting his people. And so it becomes great tribulation for God's people, and the punishment that takes place then turns upon the Antichrist and his people. And then we come to the final end. Jesus returns, and that's the second coming. And that is the stone that strikes the great image and knocks it down, grinds it into dust, and then becomes a great mountain. So again, Daniel is the key, the foundation to all prophecy of the Bible from that time forward. It's the key to the book of Revelation. John didn't use Daniel. That it said it in there. He used the imagery of Daniel. No, John recorded what he saw. What he saw was just an expansion of what Daniel saw. It wasn't that John was saying, "Oh, how can I do this and make it sound kind of prophetic?" Now, well, I'll use Daniel's language. Maybe that's not what they were trying to say in that overview, but it kind of sounded like it to me. No, John recorded what he saw, and what he saw was what Daniel saw, and that's why it's the same, because it's the same vision. It's exactly the same thing that's being talked about. All right, the last one is Jensen's 70 weeks chart, and all that I left was, oh, here it is. Wait, I got it in mind. I think I did. No, it's all there. Yeah, here's your 7 weeks. That's the rebuilding of the temple and the wall of Jerusalem. Finished in 49 years. Jerusalem is back as a nation. Then the 62 weeks that follows, and that is the time of Christ. So AD 30, some would say 33. I think 30 is a better number. AD 70 is the destruction of Jerusalem. And then we are in this time period here, this church age, the age of grace, the dispensation of grace. And we don't know how long it's going to last. The Lord knows. Jesus, while I was on the earth, they asked him. He said, only the Father knows. He gave up that knowledge until he returned back to heaven. And then the Antichrist establishes the covenant with the Jews. That starts the last week. And all of this gap period is the Gentiles, but all of this is Jewish. It is for the Jewish people, just like Gabriel told Daniel. On your people and upon the holy city, these things have to be done. And then will come all the fulfillment of what God wants for his people. All right. Nice little chart. Jensen does a good job. All right. Any questions? No, we did pretty good. Anything to add? That is all I had, right? Yeah.